Dr. Jazz.
That never were released and need work, and
See?
so at least it's been a good couple of years that way.
I told you I have them.
Hey, you look at you, man. The very first one by joint venture, our debut, our eponymous debut, is also on Enja, and it's only on LP, best I know. Matthias didn't ever re-release it on CD, and it's really too bad because, in addition to being a really special album, as debuts often are by young bands, it had an extra couple of tunes on it that would have made the CD. Didn't manage to make the LP, and it's too bad because that was quite a studio band. I mean, we played a few times live and including in Europe, but it was rare. It was really a studio band. We'd meet before making a record date and maybe a concert or two.
Really?
Ready. And we'd sight read each other's music and workshop it and jump into the studio, make a record, and then it would be another couple of years between spat of gigs and making a second record and then a third record.
It doesn't sound like it. I mean, when I listen to the record, it's very. I mean, it helps that you and Drew are really like one when you play. It's
Thank you.
When I listen to Drew and Tom Rainey, it's the same. Or these connections, long-term connections, drums and bass. This really helps. I mean.
Yeah, I'm so lucky. Drew and I met each other very early on in like 85, 86. We neither one of us had been in New York City terribly long, just a couple of years. And Drew was the first bass player I had chemistry with in New York City. And we just found so many things that were common. It was like rhythm sections and rhythm teams like Dave Holland and Jack DeJohnette were normal to us instead of being, for some people back then, it was still an odd new thing. There were a lot of conservative jazz forces. It was the time of Winton coming out, and it was post the loft scene. So there was kind of a conservative backlash. And anyway, Drew and I found so much in common. And then, of course, we found we could not only play together, but thrive together. I've always said that, playing with him, I just always sounded more mature instantly because of his note choices, his time placement. It just always brought out a wiser side of my playing, and than just the exuberant young side and experimental side.
Yeah, he's like I did one record with him and one tour, and he's like the perfect team player. I mean, even though everything he plays, it's like incredibly virtuosic, and the notes are side reads amazingly. But he's just like the Scottie Pippen of a team, kind of like this
That's
idea.
Exactly right.
It's incredible. Yeah, I also listened to the last Daydream record.
Yeah, that's how I feel exactly the same way about him, and he's just so interesting because he was able to do the sideman thing at the highest level pretty much his whole career. I mean, he started out with very conservative artists and commercial artists, whether it was Phyllis Diller or Buddy Hackett or whatever, and vocalists. And then, of course, now he plays only what he wants to play, and almost exclusively original music.
Yeah.
And it's just a great victory for somebody who's when you have the kind of range from Fred Hirsch to Paul Smoker and beyond, you've done pretty well.
That's mildly put, but true. Yeah. But you guys did like also the Daydream project. I listened to the last album, Originals, and it's so beautiful, man. And how did this one happen? This last story, this trio. I mean, like.
Yeah. Well, of course, Drew and I look for opportunities to collaborate. You know, for the last 40 years, we look for opportunities, and someone new, usually to give us a fresh frame.
Yeah.
And I have been playing with Steve Rudolph, a pianist, out here since I moved to Pennsylvania. I lived in New York almost 25 years, and when I moved out here to be with my wife, Steve was the great player in the state outside of Pittsburgh and Philadelphia. And I always assumed he was too conservative to like my playing, but a young bassist by the name of Joe Michaels fell in love with my playing and was playing with Steve at that moment. He was one of Liebman's students over in the Poconos. And so he's like 22 or 23, and he hooks us up, and Steve hires me immediately for a gig that he's had going for nearly 30 years at the Hilton down in Harrisburg. And I show up in a suit, and it's Tony Maselli on vibraphone and a great young saxophonist who's now in New York. And the next thing I know, you know, I'm in a suit. Everybody's in a suit. You know, I'm thinking, okay, it's the Hilton Hotel, and we're gonna play. I've got my brushes set, and man, 3 tunes into it, I had to pick up sticks, and I don't think I picked up brushes the rest of the night. This band was hitting. Cool. Tony was on fire that night. Steve and I just immediately had chemistry.
Yeah, you can feel that. Yeah, it's beautiful.
Yeah, it is beautiful. And you know, the tricky part with Drew is that he's played with the greatest pianists in the world in the last 40 years and has recorded with them. And so you really have to have a special pianist. And I said to Drew, I said, if the chemistry with you and Steve is like it is with me and Steve, he's worth playing with. You'll find something about him that's really fresh and different, even though he's clearly out of the post Bill Evans world. I think you're going to find something very special about his playing. And of course, you know, Steve ends up on, you know, yet another level in framing. You know, he's I don't think he's ever been with a more compatible rhythm pair.
Oh, sure.
You know,
yeah.
Recorded with some greats. There was immediate magic in the band. You know, the usual thing that Drew and I give, and it was just, you know, everybody's been beaming ever since. And so we got together and did, if you look on my Bandcamp site, there's also
I checked that one.
That's the first time we met. There's a live concert in the next morning, and it's the two of those sessions are put together. It literally, there was no rehearsal. It was standards. They were agreed upon in advance, things that neither Steve or Drew had recorded before, so they were interesting in that way, and we just hit. And you know, no amplifiers, just microphones. The three of us in a tight triangle stage, and you know, the rest is history. And then when calendars would come together every 5 to 10 years, we get together and play a few concerts, usually out here because it's easy to get to good pianos, and then we bring out John Rosenberg and make another record. And there's a third one, probably again originals, with the three of us. We had so much fun, and
that's fantastic.
Yeah, it's just the chemistry in the band is undeniable. And before all of us start to lose the high end of our abilities here as age advances, it's time to document one more time, I think.
No, come on, many more times. You got to do it. It's beautiful.
Yeah, right. You got to do it. Well, as you know, the world has changed in the last 30 years. You don't have record companies doing it anymore, and so the great thing is recording has become commonplace and so much less expensive in the last 30 years. That's the good side. The problem is you still have to finance it yourself, and now you can get it published, and now with my own sites and whatever, I can keep it available. I don't have to worry about it going out of print. All these things are so great long term, but you sometimes feel like you're in an echo chamber because except for your immediate colleagues and friends and family, boy, it is hard to get attention.
Yeah.
It is hard to
Tell me about it. Yeah.
to get the kind of traffic where people are actually listening. Even if it's on Bandcamp, you can listen for free, and even if you can download for a donation, it's like, wow, it's a tough world out there right now because it's flooded.
Yeah,
all this good information out there.
It's also tough for the attention, of people to listen. I mean, I love doing that, just like to listening to the whole album, because it's a whole story. You spend time of making a set list, why the ballad is third or whatever, or it's a storyline. But nowadays, I think people just do like download the album and shuffle tracks, or if they do, you're lucky to do if they do that. But
right.
This attention
if
span
they get
is
downloading the whole thing.
Yeah. So, but
it is a problem, and I don't know about you, but it's even for people like us who have a highly developed attention span and revel in those kinds of listening experiences and those kinds of concert experiences. Boy, as you get older, and because of the sheer volume of things that you have to go through and the artists that are out there trying to make something, I am guilty of listening to 15, 30, 80 seconds, two tunes, three tunes, and moving on if I'm not hearing the magic. I need to hear something that ties it to the tradition, but also the greatness and the innovation of the tradition. If it's already been said by somebody else, and usually better, I skip. And that's that has changed, partly because when I was young, I didn't know very much. And so the records that managed to come out, the sheer volume was so much smaller. They were already culled, right? They were culled by the producers at the record label level. They were culled by the distributors. They were culled. And then, of course, you learn to listen. Boy, if I liked Elvin Jones with John Coltrane and I liked McCoy Tyner with John Coltrane, maybe I should buy their records too. And, gee, who's this guy, Dave Liebman? And, oh, gosh, who's this guy, Chick Corea? And it just, the family spreads. And it was a reliable way to hear other great music. If you loved somebody in one context, you almost always loved them in another context. And now those families are still there, but they're harder to uncover.
Yeah, I agree, actually.
They're harder to unearth. And that makes it, that's one of the things that I teach my students, is to go back and don't just recognize the families of musicians and the communities that were making records that you loved in the past that are so well documented. Look for it now. Because that's where you find, if you find one great album, there's almost always a bunch more. And if you think somebody is great at playing, if you think somebody's really good at playing their original music, I'll bet they're also really good at playing standards. They tend to be much broader than what they get famous for. Yeah,
no, it's the amount of music. It's incredible. But Phil, I wanted to ask you this. Like you mentioned, now because I see myself when I was in that role, discovering, you find a name, and then I don't know, Ralph Towner, and then you go there, and then you go there, and John Abercrombie. Oh, who's this guy? And Mark Johnson plays with John Abercrombie. I'll check out his record, and there's Peter Erskine. What's that? Okay, this story. But like you in the mid '70s, let's say, or mid '70s, I guess. What were these records that blew your mind, drum-wise, jazz-wise? That you mentioned Elvin.
Yeah, jazz-wise, I was a little late to the party. The interesting thing was that I was taking lessons with a college student when I was in 4th, 5th, and 6th grade. And the 4th grade guy that was recommended by the local college music department chair was awful. But the guy I had studied with in 5th and 6th grade was this hip drummer from the Bay Area, from San Francisco, Oakland, who was just as into funk and David Garibaldi as he was into Elvin Jones and oddly, Buddy Rich, right? So I had a very unusual, from him alone, besides a really good foundation for a couple of years, I had this wild besides AM radio and FM radio, all of a sudden I had Buddy Rich, Elvin Jones, and Earth and Tower of Power. And he gave me the skills to sit down and be able to play a really, really, really pared down skeleton rhythm, drum beat with each of these, right? Except Elvin was so dark and so out, I couldn't figure it out, right? And so at 5th and 6th grade, I listened to that Elvin record several times in 5th and 6th grade, and then I would put it on the shelf, and every 6 months to 12 months I would listen to it again, right? Because I knew that something was going on here, right? I mean, the drumming was clearly great, but it was just so dark. It was merry-go-round, right? It's the first recording of La Fiesta, and it's a great record, right? And anyway, so I'm doing that, but it's not until several years later, when I'm in high school, that I meet a guitar player who's now in the Portland area, still in the Portland area. His name was Steve Blackman. He's one of John Stoll's students and so on. Anyway, a really sweet guy. He's a lawyer. That's what he really does, except, of course, he's a great musician who introduced me to the world of small group jazz. Because in junior high, I was listening to big bands like Buddy Rich was still cool. My friend who was a trumpet player was into Maynard, of course, and everybody was into Woody Herman. And so big band jazz was very cool. Small group jazz was still not quite coming to me. But then I met this guy, Steve Blackman, and not only did he hire me for a quartet with college students in the Northwest outside of Portland. And so, they're all 6, 7, 8 years older than I am. But then we started playing clubs in Portland, and then he also hired me for Broadway musical things that were small regional theaters that were doing musicals and whatever. So, it was this that between that and all my classical stuff, I was doing I was studying with a guy in the Oregon Symphony, and so I had a really rich background and a lot of success as a high school student in classical music. So all of a sudden, small group jazz started coming into focus, and Steve introduced me to Jack DeChenette. He introduced me, obviously not Elvin Jones, but Coltrane, and my mind was completely blown, but I wasn't connecting with it. I went to college at a little school in Iowa, Coe College, and I met Paul Smoker before he became the trumpet player that we all know. He was teaching at a small school, and I ran into him, and he told me, he dressed me down in front of the band, in front of the jazz band after 2 weeks, and said, "I don't know how many Buddy Rich records do you have? 7? You need to throw them all away." And I said, "Well, actually, I have 11." And I said, "I will never throw them away." And he said, "Well, you may never get into this band starting next semester if you don't. Your job is to never listen to them again and only listen to black drummers until you can hear the difference."
Oh man!
And you know what that is, right? Okay. And then privately in lessons with him, because he wouldn't let me take jazz lessons with the jazz drummer there. So as a trumpet player, he took me immediately in the first semester, and we started playing duets.
Oh wow!
And
beautiful.
he said, "You're totally beautiful." And of course, the abstraction level that you have to be able to play with his trumpet and drums. So this amazing relationship started. But I remember him saying to me, "Phil, you're in Iowa. Your competition are not the seniors in the band. They are not the guys at the University of Iowa. They're not the guys in Chicago. They're not even the guys in New York. They're the best 10 players on your instrument in the entire history of jazz and the entire history of classical music. Now, in 2 weeks, I want you to come and bring me a list. And you better know what you're talking about."
Wow.
Yeah. He said, "Not more than one every 10 years. And back then you could do that, right? The history, 1979, 1980, you back up and it's about one drummer a decade. Anyway, it was a fascinating experience, and it was an eye opener. And I just was like, okay, that's the way it is. Great. And so then you get to busy transcribing, you get busy playing. And I had always, how I had practiced as a kid was either to the radio, or every time I would come back from the Portland used record store, Django's, I would have a stack of records, how many ever I could record for $30 or whatever it was. And I would put on the headphones, and before I listened to them, I'd start playing with them. And that was, those two things came together. And then I asked him, there weren't many people at the time to play with at the little school we were at collegiately that would remain challenging. And I was interested in a bass player that I heard. Well, first I asked him, is it okay? I don't see anybody else doing freshman recitals, but I'm interested in doing one. He says, oh yeah, I'll sponsor you for a freshman jazz recital. That's okay. I said, would you play? And he thought about it for, 20 seconds and says, yeah, okay, I'll play. I said, I really want to build on what we're doing in our lessons, in our duets. And I said, there's a bass player in Iowa City that I really like. He says, oh yeah, who's that? And I said, Ron Rehoboth. And he says, he won't be into this music. And I looked at him and I said, he's a great bass player. He's the best guy, one of the best bass players I've ever heard live. What do you mean he won't be into this music? And Paul just laughed, because Ron was known for playing with Bill Evans style piano players, right? Well, it turns out Ron wasn't just into it. We had instant chemistry, the three of us, when we started playing original music together. And Paul was old enough and wise enough to know after that recital that there wasn't just chemistry, there was potential to do something on a world level.
Yeah.
And none of us could have had the other. Ron and I didn't have that kind of perspective. We just couldn't. And he did, and he was right, but he treated it like a collective. When our first records came out, it was under his name, but that was only because the producers said, no, it has to be under your name.
Yeah,
I was writing
your compositions.
He had me writing originals, and everybody was writing, but I wrote a lot, and it was just an amazing time. He always told me I saved his life, and clearly he saved my life, but he also told me, well, I'm ruining your life. Yeah. And he would say it over and over again. And it does change your perspective, that's for sure.
When did you start writing, and why? I mean, it's a stupid question, why, but like, because you wrote a lot of music, but when does this story begin with you?
Yeah, I did not write much early, my first couple of years in college. But I think I did write my first tune or two, and the first one never saw the light of day. But the second one, Sayeta.
Oh yeah, that's on the trio. Yeah.
Yes, with the trio. Yeah. And so on, got recorded, and so I had arranged music and written percussion original music, but I hadn't written for harmonic players before that composition. And of course I was learning about serial composers, and so that's where that material came from, which is a great place for somebody who doesn't know anything about composition, because all of a sudden, after you pick your pitch material, you're locked in, right? It's like, here we go. And so this was a great way to start. But it wasn't until I went to the Banff Center and studied with Ken Wheeler and
oh really? Oh man.
Yeah, and who's the bassist? Don Thompson, bassist and pianist and drummer and vibraphonist, and he plays everything, right?
Yeah.
And Don Thompson, I went to him and I said, can you help me? What book do I need to really get my jazz theory and my jazz piano playing together? And he said, well, I can recommend some things, but what you really need to do is not worry about piano. You've taken all your classical theory, yeah. You've taken all your jazz theory, yeah. He said, are you composing? I said, not much. He says, you have to compose. I said, I don't know where to start. He says, start. He said, don't go to a book and find out how other people do it. Just start. It might be a melody. It might be harmony. You might take rhythm changes and write your own tune. You might take rhythm changes and write your own harmony to it, your own subs. He says, start with something and go. And he said, figure it out the long way, your way. It's going to end up with much more original music than if I tell you the fast way that they do at Berkeley or North Texas State or where. And obviously, for some reason, right, he could hear that I had the talent to do that, and that's the right advice. There's other students. I have had only a couple of students that I've given that advice to, that I knew it was the right advice for them. Most students, you need to give them the traditional
schemes and method, tools and
right. Give them the fast forward, and this is how it's done. And isn't it funny? It wasn't until I taught, it wasn't until in my 40s and 50s that I met some students, and how obvious it is when you get a gifted one that has everything except the experience, right? And the question is, can you give them the right things to listen to? Can you give them the right questions to ask and to answer for themselves and all that? Anyway, Paul Smoker did that for me. And so did these guys at Banff, and I started writing. And in Paul's trio, I had A Perfect Context, and it got recorded, right? And then the next thing you know, it's one of my tunes is an album title, in our first 5 records. And the next thing you know, composing doesn't come easily, but I realized. I guess I realized I wasn't bad at it, and that my tunes had more lasting value than a lot of the things I was reading at sessions with other musicians in New York. It was like, wow, these aren't throwaway tunes. They're not kids' tunes. It's like most of them have the potential to have some life and some legs. And that was that's a blessing, that's having the right teachers. It's having great influences to draw on. But, that's just something, that all that stuff has to be, but you also have to be born, right? I had great parents, they didn't talk me out of being a musician, although they were concerned, right?
Sure.
And when I didn't want to put being an academic before being an artist, it was like, okay, go to New York. All right, you go do that, right? And most people don't have that.
How was this decision to go to New York? When did you, on the basis of what and when did you I mean, I know it's like beginning of the 80s, but how did you base that decision, and how was that like for you in the start?
Yeah, well, again, I met Paul in the fall of 1979 when I went to Coe College in Cedar Rapids, Iowa, and he had obviously already put down the gauntlet and said, who are the best 10 players on your instruments in classical and jazz? It's the international class in America. You have to go to New York City eventually. So I was thinking about that. And Coe had a nice, for juniors and seniors, a New York term where you could go and study. And half of it was, they had 4 professors in the arts there. And you would study, you would go to concerts and write reviews and whatever. And the other half was, at least for me, it was taking lessons, right? Other people, it was getting a job and being, getting some kind of tutelage or mentorship, apprenticeship. But I just took lessons, and I didn't take from drummers. I took from Joanne Breckin. I took from Liebman. From Liebman, I took from Lee Konitz. I took from Dave Holland.
Man. Beautiful.
Because I wanted an immediate context. No, that's not true. I did take from one drummer, and whose name, because he's more famous than I am, will not be mentioned. But he completely missed why I was there. Why I was there was to find out about him, right, and what was going on. And I took 2 lessons with him, and he kept on telling me I needed to, first I had to transcribe something that he played, and then I had to learn it for the next week. And so, finally I said, I'm really frustrated with this. And he said, did you do it? I said, yes, I did it. And then we had some more discussion, and he says, look, before you play it for me, we have to change your bass drum technique. And I said, why do we have to change my bass drum technique? I said, what's the reason? He says, blah, 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 blah. And I said, my understanding is you only change technique if you have something more efficient, and it will help you play something with less stress in the future that's more complex. And then it's worth redoing. Blah, blah, blah. And finally I said, no, let me just play this for you. I played it probably pretty close to flawless because I had all that classical background. And then he says, yes, but we have to talk about your bass drum technique. And I said, sit down and show me what you'd like to play. And then, like an asshole, I sat down and I played what he played twice as fast. And I walked out. All the other lessons, that was early in New York, all the other lessons were fabulous with all the non-drummers because they weren't worried. They could tell I could play. They weren't talking about drumming. They were talking about music. Yeah. And we immediately had a context because we were playing duets.
Yeah, like with Dave Fallon, man. Come on.
And I remember, right? Yeah. And I remember hiring a bass player when I went to see Joanne Brackeen so that we would have a trio, right? It was like the whole thing. And anyway, those were some of the greatest lessons ever, besides, of course, the years of lessons with Paul. And it worked out. Yeah.
I mean,
I got nothing but encouragement from those people, and I got the information. And again, people like Joanne Brackeen said, right. Keep writing.
That's so important. Yeah, that's important. Yeah. And then when you moved to New York, how was that like for you, the first weeks? Like, was it through Paul? He was in New York, right? Or no?
No, Paul was in Iowa still. A couple years later, he left his tenure track position, his full professor position. He left because the music department and retrenched the piano department, and his wife was the head of piano, and they wanted to hire her back as an adjunct, and so they left. And it turned out that she got the big gig instead of him. She got the big gig at a little place in Rochester called Nazareth. And so he went and he hung out in Rochester, but then you're only 6-7 hours from New York. So that made it even easier than being, 2 days from New York. And so he wasn't on the scene, and yet 4 or 5 times a year I would set up things. He would come down. We would do special events. There would be either recordings to do or there would be concerts. Again, I thought he might enjoy. Once I met Ellery through Drew, and the 3 of us started workshopping all the time, then Ellery said, "I'm really curious about your guy Paul," and I kind of looked at him because at that time Ellery really sounded like he was really into playing standards, and he was really into Liebman, right? He hadn't quite developed his own thing yet, and Drew was fabulous, and I told you about the chemistry immediately had, but I was like, I don't know, Paul's pretty hardcore, but they wanted to meet, and of course, next thing you know, an opportunity comes up. Liebman asks Ellery and I to organize a concert for him to read his Coltrane transcription of the Meditations record. And so we put together this concert, and he says, well, we're going to need lots of players. Why don't we do first sets? You three guys, and maybe Phil's man Paul will come down, and you because he knew Paul, I had introduced him. He says, you 4, do something, and the other 5 of us, me and Bobby Avey and Ben Porowski and whoever, we'll do a set, and then we'll do the hour-long meditations together, and that's what we did. And That was Joint Venture's first gig, and the next day we went into the studio because I talked Ellery into going into the studio, and he was all freaked out. He says, I can't go into the studio not recording standards. I can't go into the studio for my first record not with a piano. Are you crazy? It was a big deal for the month or two coming up to this concert for this to happen, but it did happen. He decided to go with it, and wouldn't you know, it was one of the most magical moments in the studio I've ever had, and there's been many. Ellery became Ellery Eskelin that night in the studio with those cats.
Yeah.
And we all came to age and matured in a way that band brought out the best harmonic writing out of each of us, and it brought out the best kinship. And it was so interesting that band, with all of its openness, almost all the charts relied on fixed harmony that we would write for it. That's what everybody did time and time again. They had forms, they had harmony, and yet we managed this great sense of freedom out of it. And it was a very fascinating band, and it really was a joint venture. It really was a collaboration, and one of the great bands I've ever been in, because it presented all of us in a context that no one had heard any of us in before.
Yeah.
Paul and I all of a sudden were brought back into the modern mainstream, and Ellery and Drew were brought into the modern avant-garde mainstream, right?
Yeah.
And what fun. And then to find out that people actually listen to it. I remember Tony Malaby came up to me when I first met him. He says, man, I know all those joint venture records. Man, it changed my life. It's the reason I'm in New York.
Wow, man.
How did you ever hear them?
Yeah. Even if you put them now on, I listened to it the other day, and it still sounds modern in a sense, because it captures what you say, this structured freedom, in a sense, what's happening in New York now, even, this idea of composition and going somewhere kind of free-ish or open in the middle and then back in. And we're talking about, I don't know, 89 or even earlier that you guys did it. So it's quite an important archive band, I think, that you guys did. So many times underrated in a sense, at least of wider exposure in my ears or eyes, but sounding really modern.
We definitely made a difference in New York City in those three or 4 years. The four of us, along with Andy Laster and several others, I organized the guys into a collective that we called the Corner Store Syndicate, and we created at the Knitting Factory for 4 years the first new jazz festival in New York in more than a decade, right, since before the loft scene hit. And it was all musician funded, right? It was like all, the 12 bands that we would present would all pitch in $300 or $400, right, before they ever hit the stage. A month before, just so we had advertising money, so that we could get into the Village Voice and put up a nice ad and advertise this music. And man, did those things get attended, and they got attended by musicians, because it wasn't just our circle. I reached out to other circles, and the next thing you know, 5 years later, Michael Dorf's asking me to produce, co-produce, as he said. He wanted me to do all the legwork for the What Is Jazz Festival, and I turned him down because I knew how much work a one-day festival or a 3-day festival was, let alone a week-long festival, and he wasn't offering any money. It was, he was looking for another grunt who was connected to do this, and I turned him down. It was probably a good idea, although it certainly would have opened other doors. But yeah, that was a really good time in New York, because a lot of people thought the downtown music was all free. It was on the Arto Lindsay, most of John Zorn's discography, instead of the things that were, still coming out of jazz and out of harmony. And there's always been another way, right? That is both the tradition and the future.
Yeah.
And you're right. The music today sounds very little different, except for the odd meters.
Yeah. Exactly. I mean,
That's
but even
the big,
Dave Holland did the other meters, like, you know, Razor's Edge, Seats of Time, those records with the quintet. Even earlier, a Conference of the Birds, man, it's 71 or
that's
something
right.
like that. You put on that
Yeah,
record, it's like, man, you know, incredible.
yeah, that was when I was at band or with Carl Berger's thing. They were always talking about the Indian rhythms and groups of twos and threes and what you could do, you know, with meters and so on. And of course, 30 years later, it became the fad in New York, and now it's a normal thing that's even taught in universities.
Sure.
Right.
Yeah.
So it advanced, but we were in the middle of it, but it's before it got to be the thing that young musicians hung their hat on. But the funny part is, they know how to manipulate rhythm just like they could manipulate scales, but very few people say much with it. That hasn't been said before.
Man,
it's still about can you? It doesn't matter the materials. Exactly. Doesn't matter the horn you've got. It's, you know, it's deeper than that. And I was lucky to have found a small, amazing community family, like we were talking about before, of musicians who all brought out the best of each other. And Paul was a huge part of that, even though he wasn't in New York City. Between his teaching to me and then when he would come to the city, I mean, he turned heads.
Sure.
Because he was such a great trumpet player, let alone, I mean, as one person in Iowa said, was absolutely hysterical. I was behind him and he didn't know I was at the bar. And we had just come off a set with Paul, and he was telling a bunch of musicians around, man, if I could play like that, and he was a great trumpet player, he really was. He says, if I could play like that, I sure as hell wouldn't play like that.
Yeah.
What an ultimate compliment.
That's the best ever.
He didn't realize he was dealing with an innovator.
True.
He didn't realize he was dealing with an innovator. And that was Paul's magic. He had enough musical experience and breadth in both classical and avant-garde classical and jazz and all the pop music, you know, that he knew.
Yeah.
And he could make educated decisions, and he could help you to be discerning, you know, kind of like today, people don't seem to be able to understand what propaganda is and how to parse information, right? And to make educated decisions. They just, you know, it's just amazing.
Yeah. So such an underrated player, Paul. I mean, you know, I mean, musicians, we kind of know, and even though, I'll lie. If I ask like all the musicians in Slovenia, including trumpet players, about Paul Smoker, shit, I don't know, man. If two would know who Paul Smoker is, like,
it's a tough one.
It's sad, but
he didn't tour often. He toured with
he
toured with Anthony Braxton, but only 3 times.
Yeah,
you know, if you know Composition 98, then you know Paul Smoker is probably the only trumpet player other than Hugh Reagan on the planet who could have played it. Yeah. And nobody would have played it like he played it, right? And it's a tough thing. But I was lucky between Herb Robertson and Paul. I played with 2 of the 3 most important trumpet players in the last 50 years. And you know, I was in the same neighborhood with Dave Douglas. You know.
Oh, really?
And Dave is great. And we always had a great time playing and whatever. But it wasn't like playing with an innovator. It wasn't like playing with Herb or Paul.
How did you meet Herb? I mean, I love Certified. Herb for me is like one of my biggest heroes. You know, we're supposed to do a tour in September with Herb, by the way. I hope it happens.
Oh, marvelous!
Yeah.
I hope it works out for you guys.
I love this guy.
Herb obviously was. Herb was playing with Tim Byrne in the 80s, in the mid 80s, in the late 80s, all the time, and so. Obviously, everybody was in New York who was into the new music, knew Tim Byrne. As a result, you knew Herb Robertson. As a result, you knew Hank Roberts and Joey Barron before they became famous with Frizzell, right? Everybody that was a family. That was a clique. It was a community that was already established. They were a few years ahead of us in terms of commercial, having their roots down. And one of the things I wanted to do with the Corner Store Syndicate when we did our festival was merge those 2 communities and beyond. right? As well as the black communities and so on. And Herb and I I remember Tim invited me over to do duets at his loft
really?
back before it was destroyed in downtown Brooklyn. And we loved each other, except there was no chemistry, right? Just no chemistry. And of course, I'm, at that time, Joey Barron's really his strength is straight eighth notes, and that's what Tim is really about. And my strength's coming out of swinging. I can make quarter notes swing, right? And so we didn't agree on rhythm, which is really where the magic has to happen,
sure.
Right? And it wasn't that we didn't agree; it's just we didn't have it in common. We didn't have that magic, say, that Drew and I had, or Ellery and I, because we all love to swing, right? In addition to love straight eighth notes. So that didn't work out. But Andy last year hired Hank Roberts and myself and Herb Robertson to do his second record. I did Andy's first record with a great band that he hired, but then that second record, Twirler.
Oh, Twirler, yeah, I love that one, man. I love that record.
It's one of my favorite records. I mean, it's still so terrific.
And Hippo Stomp also, like those both, yeah, killing records.
That's where I met Hank Roberts, and I kept on thinking I got to get a band together that features Hank, and then I've got to get a band together. I've got to meet. I mean, Herb Robertson just blew my mind because, we did this record, and then we would meet because he was in the neighborhood too, and we would meet, near the bagel place or whatever. We'd run into each other coming out of the movie theater, or out of the park, or out of the subway. And I remember one day we were chatting, and neither one of us had much going on that afternoon. It must have been a weekend. And I said, "Hey, you want to come over and play some duets?" He says, "Oh, great. I'd love to." Well, I was considered a free player at that time. I learned what free playing was when I ran into Herb Robertson. And as I like to tell people, if there were no instruments left on the planet, and it's back there to Planet of the Apes at the end, if it's the Empire State Building or the Statue of Liberty that's left, he could play a solo concert on it, and people would be freaked.
Yeah, he's a monster.
Doesn't matter what he touches, he can make music. He has that shamanistic kind of ability. It's stunning. And if he's with other people with like tendencies, that kind of chemistry or openness, all of a sudden it multiplies through a group. You only need 2 or 3 in a group that are open, and all of a sudden the whole group is, even a big band, is completely transformed by him.
Yeah, and
he still can do it, as you may have heard if you listen to some of Jim Yanda's trio music from a couple of years ago with Herb and I. He's just amazing. So anyway, and I remember Andy wanted me to do his third record too, and it was all this stuff, 3.5, 4, and crazy metric stuff that I really had to go back to school on. And then I was staring in the face of Herb, trying to figure out how to be completely open and free versus the math music. Mm-hmm. And I felt like, at least for those 2 or 3 years, I needed to make a decision. Right? It was the first time in my life I didn't feel like I could multitask. I felt like I had to submerge myself in one or the other. And of course, I chose Herb because he was an innovator.
Yeah, definitely.
Right?
Yes, yeah, sure.
I mean, wow. Yep. It was like a black hole. You were just sucked in. You couldn't help it, right?
True.
And we've been great friends and colleagues ever since. And I remember he would call it ritual music. It's not free, Phil. It's like we're getting together it's sacred music. It's ritual music, And it did. Those open sessions would transform musicians' lives who would come to the corner store and play with him and with us. And then we would set up sessions just to play open because Herb was so great at it. And it affected a lot of people. It got to the point where when I came out to teach for 5 or 6 years out here, I actually, the first chairman of the department said to me, "What's the most important ensemble that you could do that wouldn't just be for jazz players?" And I said, "Well, I want to teach new music improvisation." And she said, well, that's usually a dead end. You know, we all tried it in the 60s and the 70s. And, you know, it just seems to be, you know, it starts out either loud or soft, and then it grows and then it dies out, and there's nothing, nowhere. I said, well, I had a little different experience in New York.
Yeah.
And I think I said, I think your classical players are going to have their minds blown, and I probably won't let any or almost no jazz musicians into it, because I don't want, it's not about that kind of referential music. It's about modern contemporary music. It's not about jazz. And boy, did that group work. Holy cow. The next thing, within a couple of years, we weren't just musicians, we were actors, we were dancers, we were multimedia guys coming, you know, calling me up, you know, from the computer places, bringing in, I mean, it was insane. We had so much fun, and it opened up all kinds of people to their inner selves. And you got rid of stage fright. You got rid of, I mean, just all these things that normally were in the way of classical players, and it just all melted away.
It's all interconnected, yeah, like how we do it, yeah. It's beautiful.
So that was fun. I always told them that you guys have two grandfathers. One is Herb Robertson and one is Paul Smoker. I may be your daddy, but you have grandfathers. And then I remember Liebman one night after a gig coming back, I was driving him back, and he said, you know, Philly, he says, man, I know that oh shoot, who's the legendary trumpet player? I'm spacing on his name, of course. Who's the legendary trumpet player who was never recorded in New Orleans? He was the first guy that Louis Armstrong, everybody talks about. Buddy Bolden. See, my wife even knows that. I don't know why I was stuck on his name. Man, this is getting older shit is just awful. Anyway, Liebman says, Buddy Bolden would dig your ass. I said, oh, please, Dave. I said, that's wonderful, but like, how can you say that? He says, no. He says, check it out, Billy. He says, you got it double barreled. Let's just talk about you through me and you through Smoker. With Smokey, he says he goes right back to the pianist that played with Charlie Parker. And Charlie Parker knew Ellington. And Ellington and Ellington and Armstrong knew Buddy Bolden. He says, man, that's just 4 to 5 generations. He says, that's direct lineage.
Yeah.
He says, man, through me, you go straight through Miles. Miles played with Bird, right? Goes right back. He says, I am telling you, your lineage, you have the responsibility to hand it on, and trust me, it comes right from the source.
Yeah. Makes sense if you put it like that. Yeah.
When you say it like that, it makes total sense. Yeah. Lieb is like that. But he'll say these things that seem so outrageous. Well, Smoker could do that too. But these things that are so outrageous, and then when he tells you about it, it's like, wow. And you never see the world the same way again.
Yeah. True.
Your mind is blown, but it's also, you know, just slightly enlarged. You know, it's like, oh, that is a better perspective.
Yeah.
And it's not something to be all proud of and puffed up about. It's like, oh, boy, we have an immense thing. And it's like, no wonder this is working. No wonder other musicians look at me a certain way. No wonder I still look at myself despite all my shortcomings a certain way. I did get this directly. This has been, and it was interesting because some of the people, I'm trying to remember, there's a great new music pianist, a woman in New York City. I had her here. Classical pianist. New music.
Oh shit!
Yeah, I'm trying. Her name will come back, and I'll send it to you in an email when it comes back to me. But she said when she heard my new music ensemble, because she came in the fall, right? She was part of the big program being brought into our Performing Arts Center, and part of her thing was outreach to the music department, and the classical piano teachers all turned her down. We don't have students that are ready. It's too early in the semester. And I got wind of this, and I said, oh, she can come to my ensemble, right? My free music ensemble. And of course, as it turns out, we fell in love with each other. She loved what the group was doing. She played with us and with the pianist, right, who was just a sophomore. And she talked about how this was, she said, it's you and me since Liszt teaching improvising in classical music. And then she went through the lineage of all the people who, as great pianist composers who wrote for improvisers and would, of course, improvise the cadenzas, right? Yeah. But then it had been 80 years, right? It was her teacher who studied with Liszt, and before that, and Schumann, and it was before that. One of them was Clara, and Ray. It was like, my mind was blown, but she knew. And she says, do you know we're the only two, maybe in America, maybe in the world, teaching this?
It's funny if you put it like that, but it's true. Yeah. If you go back.
I got it from Herb Robertson. Had I not known, because the things that Paul did with other faculty at my university and all the things that I had heard from the 60s were failures, right? Or nice tries, but they weren't consistent. I met Herb Robertson, and if you could just get people to think like he did and to not copycat, right? Yep. And just a few basic rules, right? And the next thing you know, you got ensembles that are speaking this language, and it's unbelievable.
Exactly. Yeah. Speaking of ensembles, and you mentioned Liebman, I wanted to ask you about No Fast Food, because it's so nice to hear. I mean, we started with Drew and you, and it's so nice to hear you and Drew burning under Dave. And it's many times it's forgotten that Dave, David Liebman, he's, like you said, he's one of the guys who played with Miles, and of course he's made like 6 zillion records as a band leader, and played with Elvin also, when you mentioned early 70s. But how did that group happen? I mean, you probably played with him in the 80s already, but like, how do you see it, this group now, when you were older and mature in the early 2010s playing with David? How did that happen, and how was it like?
Yeah, let me back up a half a second and try not to get off the. I was urged by people when I made my first record that happened to be Dave Kikoski and Drew Gress.
Yeah, I wanted to ask you about that one also.
I wrote it for Mark Feldman, and I was urged by all kinds of cats who were older than I was, more famous than I was, more worldly. No. You have to go to Rudy Van Gelder's if you're going to record, and you got to use famous guys, and you got to play standards. And I would listen to these records, and I'd go, man, the best I can do assuming I had the money to hire Herbie Hancock or Chick Corea or whoever, which I didn't, and Dave Holland, the best I could sound like would be Tony Williams. And I can't sound that good. I would never have a chance to sound like Phil Haynes. I knew that early. And I was like, oh, no. So instead, I found Mark Feldman, who I met through a friend who went to Banff the years after I did. He met Feldman. He invited Feldman to come to New York. At that time, Feldman was both in Chicago and Nashville doing string sweeteners and studio work. He had never made a jazz record, but he had already met Liebman, and Liebman had hipped him to Spignude Seifert, right? And so Feldman and his classical, obsessiveness transcribed everything that Spignude would play and ripped licks, right out of Spignude's thing, and then put them on steroids, right? Yeah. Because of course he knew how to do theme and variations, right? And so he would improvise from that. Well, anyway, that's ended up being a great record. It was all my originals. It worked out great, but didn't get much attention at the time. But look at everybody's career. And if you go back and listen to the record, oh, by the way, the music still sounds fresh, and it still sounds great. Well,
how did Kikoski? Sorry.
At that time, my friends were saying, "Oh, you got to play with Liebman. Liebman. You should be recording with him." And I said, "I can't play better than Billy Hart. I said maybe I can. Maybe Jeff Williams is, you know, I can hang with Jeff Williams as a drummer and whatever, but, you know, and I'm no Elvin Jones, and it's like, no, right? And I knew that it would be 20 plus years from the time I was Liebman's student to then we'd find out if we still had chemistry and if something could happen. And I came out of having Continuum and then the 4-horn band, a quintet.
I love that one.
Tour in Europe, which did tour in Europe, did make a couple of records, and was a huge impact on the New York scene for 5 years that we were together, even though we only did a handful of concerts a year. But I wanted a trio that would be easy to get around Europe. And at first it was, I thought Hammond organ, and I tried Jeff Palmer out, and Jeff was great, except for a year and a half, we had a great time playing free and playing his music and occasionally playing standards that he would pick. And there was great chemistry with Paul, and I was like all excited about this because he had such a great approach to the organ, and he was clearly brilliant and whatever. Turned out he can't read.
Really?
He tell me.
Really? I didn't know that. Wow.
He can read C minor to D major. If he had just told me all I can read is basic changes, I'll take care of the rest, Philly, everything would have been fine. But instead, I had a week at the knitting factory, and it was the most. I had 6 days that I hired. I hired a recording crew, I hired a video crew, and he didn't show up for 3 days of rehearsals. He shows up to the gig, and of course he can't play any of my music. He can't read any of it. He can't do any of it. It was awful. But I came out with a couple of nice discs for Hat Art, and anyway, that was a big thing. I was still looking for a trio, and so then it was like, okay, I'm done with organ for a while. I couldn't find an organ player after Jeff because I really loved his playing, and I thought, no, Ellery was off doing his thing, so Drew and Ellery and I weren't doing anything after the first 10 years, sort of mid 80s to mid 90s. After that, Ellery started doing other things. And I thought, okay, I need to find a saxophonist. Well, that wasn't easy. The best one, I tried lots of famous people. Chemistry just wasn't right. You know, it was like, it was good, but it wasn't great. And of course, I was featuring them on my music. And so that's yet another layer that you have to find common ground in. And Greg Tardy ended up being terrific for a couple of concerts.
Really? Oh, beautiful.
Yeah, I met him, and it just worked out, and there was good chemistry in the group. I don't remember quite how his name came to my attention, but it worked out. But then he got married, left music for a year and a half or 2 years to do church music, right? And that was right exactly when I was trying to make a record. And so, okay, that isn't working. So this poor saxophone trio, the whole trio idea of Phil to do Phil's music just wasn't happening, right? I couldn't find it. And then I was out here at Bucknell teaching full time, and I had a little jazz series that I had started with the help of the president out here. And one of the people I brought was Dave. And Dave says, I brought him out for a solo concert. He does a solo concert. It's fantastic. Because the next time, Phil, you bring me out, let's do some duo. I said, great.
Oh, that's how the duo happened. Okay. Yeah.
I did. I called him up a couple of years later, and I said, you're due to come back. And why don't we do that duo we talked about? Oh, great, man. Let's just play free. And I said, no, I've already written music for you. Oh, just for the two of us? I said, yeah. I said, beautiful. Let's do it. So he walks in. I wrote music so that it really could be sight read, right? It really could, at least with him, because he's a great reader, but also, just keeping it simple so that we could really get to the improv. I cannot tell you, man. He read the whole record. We were done in 2 hours.
Mm-hmm.
The recording, the rehearsal, everything done in 2 hours. It was the fastest, most brilliant, effortless record I ever made. And the chemistry was so clear. And so then I asked him, I said, would you like to do some trio on my music with Drew? He says, well, man, that ain't going to take no rehearsal. That shit. Let's do it.
I see it, man.
That should be a motherfucker, man. I'd love to play with you and Drew, man. I've not played much with Drew, and that'd be great. And the rest is history. the chemistry was there. The old chemistry between Dave and I was there. Drew loved the few times he had worked with Dave, and Dave remembered Drew, and of course I remember that first rehearsal here in my living room before we played a concert later that day, and Dave looked at Drew and said, "Boy, have you become a motherfucker."
That's a beautiful. I think you should send this to Drew to have it like on his website. The quotes. That's.
There was another great one 20 years before with Paul Smoker in Europe. We were playing Friedrichsburg, I think, and I can't remember the guy. I can see his face, and it may come back to me. I can't remember his name right, but there was a German critic. He wrote for Jazz Podium, and we played an epic concert, 3 sets, and then an encore set that was 4 tunes long, another 50 minutes. So Paul played four solid hours, maybe 5, and the trio played that long, and we never repeated a tune. And blah 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 blah. We've never heard music like this. It could be the answer for trumpet and jazz and new music in the future. Drew Gress's playing were like mountain ranges that Smoker played upon.
Wow, nice.
And it was true.
Yeah.
Drew, when he was right, and Drew said, I only played a couple of concerts with Paul where I felt like I had my shit together. He says, that was the first one where I suspected it was right, and you guys told me it was right. But he says, mountain ranges, I'll take that.
That's beautiful, man. Yeah.
Yeah, it was beautiful. It's
That's
somewhere
cool.
years ago in Jazz Podium. Oh, I have to remember what that guy's name was. What a sweetheart. Every time we go through on tour, whether it was with Paul, always with Paul, and also later when Paul was with me with the 4-horn band or whatever, he would host us. He would host us, for at least coffee, at his apartment. Just the kind of people that you meet on the road,
Sure.
And they're past fans. They become friends.
It's nice that. I know what you mean.
The community is unbelievable that way.
Yeah, that's beautiful, man. Nice stories. Nice to hear your. What's the future? What have you brewing?
Well,
album-wise, let's say. Or
I started having some technical problems with my hands. There's some degeneration that's in my family. For my mom's side, it's arthritis, but there's actually some weird stuff that happens through my dad's side of the family that my sister and my aunt, his sister, had, and I have. And some of it got exacerbated because while I was going through and doing all this stuff in New York with music, I was being a painting contractor and a plastering contractor. And I'm sure I was able to give it up when I came out here and started teaching full-time at Bucknell doing music. I was able to give it up, which was probably great, but I know that I ended up having problems with my hands 10 years earlier than I should have, because I would get shooting pains and blah, blah. Anyway, and signs of repetitive motion problems. And I had never had any technical problems. I remember when whether it was Mark Feldman or Ben Monder or pianists were going through it in New York, saying I had to stop for 6 months. I had to stop for 2 years. Couldn't do it. And I had to reteach myself how to play. Fortunately, it only took months because I already knew how to play, but I had to stop completely in order to get the inflammation out. Well, COVID did that for me. I had been cutting back on everything but music and making and cooking with my wife. And I loved bicycling, right? I had ridden my bike across the country. I had raced my bike, in New York City and whatever, and I had to stop cycling. I was doing 10,000 miles a year, and I had to stop cycling because the shifting, the braking, was just driving me crazy. Mowing the grass, the stupidest things, right? And it got your confidence. These are things that you use to blow off steam and to keep your head straight and whatever. And then COVID hit. And let me tell you, I have to drive as it is to play with guys I don't have to teach, to play with up here. Steve's in Harrisburg, so that's an hour and 15 minutes. That's the closest somebody is. Lieb is an hour and 40 minutes, when he was in the Water Gap. Now he's in New York City, right? Anyway, the list is really short. I have to go to New York City. Thankfully, it's only 3.5 or 4 hours away. Problem is, it's 3.5 or 4 hours away. Yeah. And we all know what happened with COVID.
Yeah.
And so socially, I was in a very bad place until this fall when I had a couple of gigs with Steve Rudolph. And all of a sudden, because I was worried, I thought, not only are my hands, in a bad place, even though the pain had gone, I had worried that my mental game would be lacking too. And turned out my mental game was totally on. All I had to do was play with great players again. And yes, technically there are certain things like you asked the question, and so this is to answering it. Don't think that no fast food is in the cards anymore, because what I hear to play with that band needs world-class virtuosity out of my chair. And that is hard now. I can play piano trio, right? Romantic piano trio. I could probably play free country. I can do a lot of things, but boy, that upper end that I learned with Paul and when I play with Drew and I play with Dave, that's what hits my ears. It isn't, a lot. I can play 70% of it, but what do you do about that last 20 or 30?
Yeah. I know what you mean. Yeah.
You need to hit the pedal and it's not there, and it isn't there. So I don't know. It could come back, but it's hard because I'm isolated. I've always been isolated since I got out here. But at that time, it didn't seem like a problem. But now, because I don't have anybody to play with that I don't have to teach, and even then you can't get together without masks and blah, blah, blah. Anyway, it's very difficult. It's difficult being out in the middle of nowhere now. So I don't know. Free Country has a record that had to be postponed because we were ready to go in January, February, right when COVID hit, and in New York City, and everybody hit the brakes.
Yeah.
And then we all know what happened. We all know what happened in March. And so that has been postponed. But that band has always been a cover band to do Americana, and one of my other passions, when I went to New York to be a sideman, and I ended up being a leader because I found out that even though I had the skills to be a sideman, my personality was too big for a lot of people to have, right? And Marvin Smitty Smith talked about that. Oh, you have to have all those conservative gigs before you let anybody know what you're really into. If you don't own the commercial world, you'll never own the big world.
He knows.
Yeah, he knew, and he knows, and anyway, that band Free Country, I had always thought, oh, what a great fourth studio record if instead of playing covers, we play our music. And so the plan will be for each of us to bring in 3 tunes for the band, and that will be a great thing. So that I know I can do. Fantastic. I know I can do another piano trio with Drew and Steve Rudolph, and there are many other things. Fortunately, other people, my old colleagues, still call me up from time to time to do a project. And again, as long as it's not with that sort of upper crust of virtuosos and innovators, I can still play. When it gets up there, I don't want to sound.
I know what you mean.
I don't want to sound like so many cats who were past their prime and still trying to record that stuff. I mean, I get that there are Chet Baker fans out there who love his last 10 and 20 years, but come on.
Yeah, I know what you mean.
I was never Chet Baker. No one wants to hear a drummer who's stumbling, right?
Oh, it's good that you realize that, or that you know that. I mean, that's okay. I mean, you discover some other paths. That's cool. There's so much music out there to be discovered, so that's
exactly. And the great thing is that I found out I still can play, and I still can change people on the set and set them free. On the bandstand. And it's like that magic is still there. It doesn't matter whether I have that kind of virtuosity anymore. And it's just interesting. I always my first goal was always to become a great musician and a great drummer second. And
Yeah.
and I did that, and I still was a pretty great drummer, but not Marvin Smitty Smith great or Billy Cobham great or Tony Williams great, but like, wow, I still could really play. And not Buddy Rich great, but like, boy, for somebody who really wanted to be a musician who also was a drummer, I did just fine. But it's interesting that I'm very selective about what I, at least right now, until I can play with more people again on a regular basis at a high level, I'm very careful about what I say yes to.
Sure. If you
at least out of my own bank
good.
account. Got to be careful who you hire. Make sure they're still going to help you sound great.
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah, man. No, well, beautiful. Thanks, Phil, for sharing some of these thoughts, man. Appreciate it.
Yeah, you're welcome. And just to put a bow on it, we didn't talk about Sanctuary. It was never out on a major label, but that's my solo project. And I remember
exactly.
between Paul Smoker and when I first heard Braxton's Alone, and then when I heard him 2 or 3 times, I had the privilege of hearing him 2 or 3 times live playing solo alto saxophone concerts. And I knew at that point that, I was going to have to make a solo record at some point.
That's a tough one.
And then it took 20 years for me to mentally prepare, like, what the hell am I going to do? Right.
Yeah,
and I am so glad that I did it. And it was so unusual because Gebhard Ullman introduced me. We went in with he and Andreas Villers to this SFB, the old East Berlin studio that was built for Von Karajan and the Berlin Philharmonic, behind the old wall. And that studio, you can literally hear a pin drop in, and you can record it. And if you play a millidynamic too loud, you wash everything out. It's just the way it is.
Yeah.
And I found out I could play in there, and the engineers were ecstatic. As it turned out, they couldn't capture my bass drum sound, and I got them to come into the studio and hear it in the room, and then go hear what they were recording and going, oh, I get it. It's not accurate. Finally, they brought out a microphone, and I said, that's it. And they said, it better be. I said, why that? It's a custom-made $40,000 Neumann that was made for, I don't remember, one of the most famous violinists, like Heifetz or somebody, right? It was made for blah, blah. And a violin mic was the only thing that would grab this silly bass drum sound. And they heard it, and they were so excited about it.
Sure.
The Tone Meister going nuts, right? Going nuts to capture Phil Haynes' bass drum sound. And anyway, we had great fun. I figured out that I could put together 2 to 4 minute small pieces that were part of larger streams of consciousness, multi-movement works, and then reconstruct that after 4 live sets for SFB that they all put out on radio. Then I made a studio version, selecting what I thought was the best. It was not easy it was not as easy as slicing and dicing and putting it together. It took a lot of effort to keep the magic, because you find out that even though the magic is there in an individual piece, part of it's because of what surrounds it.
Yeah.
So anyway, it was a great project, but I did figure out, and I was playing mostly soft, right? The opposite of what you expect out of a drummer. Lots of soft, lots of space, lots of listening to the resounding tones and reverb in the room, and and doing it without headphones, because all I did was make sure that they were capturing what I was hearing in the room. And once that was over, took the headphones off and just played the room. And it was a miraculous experience. I have Gebhard to thank for introducing me to those guys, and then them believing in it and being so passionate about it. And that's a magical recording, and it changed my playing for the last 30 years because I figured out how to do it. I figured out how to put up something that didn't sound like anybody else's. Yeah,
also to create tension by playing, quiet and stuff like that. That's so important. I saw Jim Hall years ago, and he played like living room loud on a stage. Yet it was so loud. It was so quiet, but it was like you could hear it was Scott Colley, and I don't know who was on drums, but it was just like incredible the tension he created. But he played so quiet, you know, and there was so much tension and music there. It's beautiful stuff. I mean, but so I know what you're saying. It's like it's when this happens, this is magic, you know.
There is a universe of sound and tension and color below piano, right? Below, I mean, hushed. And all of a sudden and percussion instruments are perfect for this.
Yeah.
But acoustic instruments of all kinds, things like guitars that are just not as loud as wind instruments, right? They get it. Piano players get it, right? Percussionists get it. And wow, again, it's like Herb Robertson. And he gets it. Once you can tap into that kind of intimacy, it's like putting a microphone or a microscope on your playing, right? And you're in a place where if you play anything past mezzo piano, it's too loud. And so all of a sudden, once you learn to work in that universe and hear it, then that's what made it possible for Steve Rudolph and I to hit, because of course he was playing an acoustic piano with no amplification, and I could play with it, and I could burn the house down, and so could he. And the next thing you know, when we do records, there's never an amplifier in the house.
Sure.
Not for the bass player, and that means the drummer's got a deal. And I was lucky. I was really lucky for all that early classical training, and I was lucky to run into Gephardt in that SFB studio, and that studio kicked my butt between the two record dates I did before in the year, as I prepared mentally to do the solo date. Was like, that was the key, was to look into that, under that microscope, in those microphones, in that incredibly soft area that's really too soft to play live most of the time in most clubs, right? And it opened up a whole universe. Anyway, it was a great experience.
Yeah, that's true. Beautiful.
And I can now look Anthony Braxton in the face and say, yes, I made a solo record too, and you would dig it.
You should send it to him.
Absolutely. We share the same engineer, so I know he's heard it.
Okay.
Or he had a chance to hear it.
It's beautiful, man. Yeah.
So how about you, man? Are you is anybody reacting in the echo chamber to that amazing undertaking you did with Dolphy's music?
Yeah, I getting really good response. I'm so happy with it. Like, you know, people are really buying actually records on Bandcamp, like not before. I'm surprised, and reviewers are saying they're gonna write stuff, so let's hope they will, you know. And but yeah,
I hope they will too.
It was just like a learning experience, you know, just to do that. That was to listen to those tracks again in detail, man. So much fun. And to take an acoustic guitar and just like just disregard the acoustic guitar heritage, basically, like you did with drums. You know, I don't have to reharmonize every note like Joe Pass or whatever. If Steve Lacy can play a single line and Dave Liebman can make a solo saxophone record, that means I can play single lines on a track. You know, I don't need to play chords. And that's what I did. You know, I played like, I don't know, in 17 West by Dolphy, and I played solo, no intervals even, just like, man, it was so liberating to do that. It's just like felt, why didn't I do it before? You know, it's incredible. But it's true. It's, you know, playing guitar, it can be so scary, you know, since just because of that, you have to do something. But fuck that shit, you don't have to do that. You know, you can just, but it takes time, I guess, to realize that. So, yeah, so I'm really happy with this one. So, yeah.
Well, you should be. And, you know, may you and all of us keep on taking on appropriate monumental projects like that. I mean, that's if we don't throw down the gauntlet for ourselves, then we then we don't grow nearly as fast as we should or could. Anyway,
I agree. Yeah,
anyway. Isn't it interesting? Nobody had done it before, and they should have.
Yeah, it's funny if you. I mean, yeah, especially the Dolphy. It's like such an underrated composer, man. Also, it's I mean, everyone knows kind of serene-ish.
Sure.
But hair and beard, maybe out to lunch, maybe, and then there stops. What people know about compositions.
Big drop off.
Yeah.
Yeah, there's a big drop off.
Yeah, like something sweet, something tender, and stuff like that. Man, that's so beautiful. It's the prophet. Like,
it was like what 1979 that 79 in the early 80s that Monk had his revival, right? And then of course it went on, right? But he had this revival, and all of a sudden people started realizing it wasn't a dozen tunes, it was dozens of great tunes.
Exactly. Yeah.
And Dolphy isn't quite have that big an output, but it's still dozens of great tunes.
Yeah, I mean, man, it's like 28 compositions.
Yeah.
If you asked me like 10 years ago,
it's a couple dozen terrific tunes.
Yeah. Like 15 are amazing. I mean,
and those are only the ones we know of.
Yeah.
God knows what was in his notebooks and got played at sessions that never got recorded, right? Exactly. So we don't know about them. Because once again, people are great musicians are always broader than you think they are, than whatever they get famous for. Otherwise, they wouldn't be as good as they are. And anybody who composes doesn't compose one. Coltrane didn't compose Naima, and that was it, right?
Sure.
They wrote a lot.
Sure.
They wrote a lot. Yeah.